Our next guest has been on with us a couple of times, and it is always such an honor to have him here. He is such an interesting guy, so much fun, and we could just talk and talk and talk. His name is Stephen Spignesi. Stephen is a New York Times bestselling author who writes about historical, biography, popular culture, television, film, American and world history, and contemporary fiction. He's also a professor, novelist, poet, screenwriter, and musician. Steve christened the world's leading authority on Stephen King by Entertainment Weekly's magazine. He's worked with Stephen King, Turner Entertainment, the Margaret Mitchell Estate, Ron Howard, Andy Griffith, the Smithsonian Institute, George Washington's Mount Vernon, Viacom, and other personalities and entities on a wide range of projects. Steve also has contributed essays, chapters, articles, and introductions to a wide range of books. He has more than 60 books. They've been translated into several languages. He's also written for Harper's Magazine, Cinefantastique, Saturday Review, TV Guide, Mystery Scene, Gauntlet, and Midnight Graffiti magazines, as well as the New York Times and the New York Daily News. In the New York Post, the New Haven Register, the French literary journal Tessenbrun, the Italian online literary journal Horit. Steve has also appeared on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and other TV and radio outlets. He's also appeared in the 1998 E-documentary The Kennedys, Power, Seduction, in Hollywood as a Kennedy family authority. And I want to talk to him about the Kennedys, especially after Ted Kennedy's son came out with this interview just the other day. He also put together Stephen King's, the Complete Stephen King Encyclopedia, was a Bram Stoker Award nominee in 1991. In addition to writing, Steve also lectures on a variety of popular culture and historical subjects and is a practitioner in residence at the University of New Haven, an adjunct professor at Gateway Community College in Connecticut. He's the founder and editor-in-chief of the small press publishing company, the Stephen John Press. He's an amazing guy, and let's just go ahead and get to him because we got a lot to cover tonight. Steve, good evening. Welcome to K-Talk and the Fringe Radio Show, my friend.
Hey, Pat. Great to be back.
Oh, it's always fun to have you here. How's your weather out east?
Oh, come on. We're talking about a New England October. It doesn't get much better than this. Right now it's mid-50s, dry,
beautiful.
Just gorgeous. Absolutely beautiful weather.
Just beautiful, just beautiful. Well, I read through all your stuff because there's so much there, and I wanted people to get a flavor of what you do. You've written over 60 books on so many different subjects, and the way I came across you was, which I'd like to talk a little bit about and talk about some of the stuff you're working on and going forward and the Kennedys and stuff. We'll just cover everything. Your book, Titanic for Dummies, that came out, and I found that so appealing. That's how I first came across you and called you and said, hey, would you do the show? And then you taught a class on that, correct?
Yeah, Titanic for Dummies was my second Titanic book. The first one came out in 1999. It was called The Complete Titanic. And then as I write for the dummies people. That's what we call it. But I've written 4 of the 4 dummies books, and they said, the 100th anniversary is coming up. Is there any way that you could conceive, the Titanic story within the context of a dummies book? Because they're a very strict template, as we talked about last time. Mm-hmm. And I said, yeah. And so I did it, and it came out. And in the spring 2012 semester, I talked to the chair of the English department at UNH, and I said, the literature and legacy of the Titanic. I said, I think that would be a really interesting course. And they jumped at it, and the course filled up immediately, and we did a whole semester on the history and the legacy and the literature of the Titanic. We used my book as the course text, and we also included coverage of all of the writings and the media coverage and other books. And it was really quite something. It's the most famous shipwreck in world history, pretty much. So yeah.
Are they still offering that class?
No, it was what's called a special topic course. Although I did, I did ask my boss if we could do it again soon, maybe spring 2016. But the thing is, I have a really, really full load of basic English comp and lit courses that, we have a really big freshman incoming body every year. So as a PIR in the English department, my primary responsibility is being able to teach 60 to 80 freshmen every semester comp and lit, because they have to take those courses before they can move on to their main, their
Right.
major courses. So, but we'll see. We'll never. I have a couple of others in mind that I did a writing for publication course, which was really popular. And you mentioned King. One of the first courses I taught at UNH, I've been there, I don't know, 7, 8 years now, and one of the first courses I taught was the new Gothic horror of Stephen King. And that went over. That was a pretty popular course as well.
When you did your books on King, did you have a chance to sit down and meet with him at all?
Well, King authorized and participated in my encyclopedia. Now, I've done 5 books on King. That was my first. And I went to him and said, here's what I want to do. And he wasn't crazy about the idea, but only because he doesn't think that books about his work are worth doing. He feels that the books should stand on their own, and that, you read his novels, you read his short stories, and that should be enough. But the thing is, there's a huge fan base of people who want to know more about King and his work. And so the encyclopedia was groundbreaking in a sense. I mean, it was 8.5 by 11 pages. It was a Bram Stoker nominee, and he participated in the sense that he sent me some college writings. He was there for answers through his secretary, Shirley, who has since retired. But I didn't really impose myself upon him at all, because this guy is, he's on a 2-book-a-year pace pretty much all the time. And he just is amazing to me, how prolific he is, how creative he is, how he can constantly come up with new stories, and how his writing is getting more and more literary. I mean, now he won the National Book Award. President Obama just gave him the National Medal of the Arts for lifetime achievement. I mean, I've said from day one he's the Poe, Dickens, and Twain of our time.
Right.
And in 50 years, his best stuff is still going to be read and be taught. Be taught. He's taught at the high school and college level now widely in America.
Is he kind of a unique character?
Pardon me?
Is he kind of a unique character? Is he kind of an odd guy, or is he just a normal guy?
He's a normal guy. He's a family man. And the thing is, he's, I can answer that question this way. Every artist is a weirdo.
Right, right.
Anyone who would focus on seeing the world and interpreting the human condition and life with a magnifying glass and trying to understand it deeper and then express those insights through works of art, whether it's songs or paintings or novels or nonfiction, that's the creative, I'm not saying anything new. The creative person, the artist, has always been kind of an outlier in society, because one of the horror writers I interviewed for that encyclopedia, Jerry Williamson, who has since passed on, he said artists, Stephen King in particular, and artists in general, are noticers. Mm-hmm. We notice the way, for instance, if a woman is in a store and she leans over a showcase and she makes this move with her left hand where she puts her pocketbook behind her back a little bit so it doesn't swing forward. Most people wouldn't even notice that happening. Artists see that and say, I got a character that I could use that,
Right. Interesting. One of our listeners, actually the last time you were on, and I meant to forward this to you, and I actually kept this question from a couple of years ago.
Oh, geez, hope I can answer it.
I think you can. She actually sent me a long email, and she bought a couple of your books. She purchased some of your books that were available. And the question she was going to, I said, just contact Stephen through email. She liked the way your books read and take this the right way. And it's very simple to comprehend the way you write. Have you ever considered doing a book on Stanley Kubrick?
A book on Kubrick.
Is he's
Well, there.
he's got some a lot. I know a lot of his. He was a very private type of guy. A lot of stuff was locked down. I've actually tried to get his daughter on the program a couple times with no avail. To no avail, I should say. But I know there's some people out there on Facebook and in some websites that are popping up, and there's a lot of strange stuff that's coming up that he took photographs of and grabbed stills of, and he's kind of it was a very unique duck.
Well, I'll tell you, my answer to that would be, if anything, I'd be interested in possibly doing a book on his work. I'm not a real big fan or all that interested in doing biographical stuff. Even though I write biographical stuff, the bulk of it is about the accomplishments, the achievements, the art. So the films of Stanley Kubrick would be right in my wheelhouse. That would be something that I could definitely get into. But researching his life and discussing, as a matter of fact, it's funny you asked that and that she asked that, because I was reviewing a list of literary biographies, right, online. So one of the online journals did a list of the 10 best literary biographies, and the one that this reviewer liked the most was a massive 4-volume set on Henry James.
Really?
And I said to myself, really? I don't think I would have the slightest interest in the life of Henry James. His work, absolutely. But, there was another one that was a 2-volume set on Ezra Pound. Mm-hmm. And, King has often addressed this, and he said, writers are really boring people. We sit in a room with a pad or a computer or a typewriter, and our work is how we enter the world, so to speak. He said, so, these massive biographies of writers, yes, if there are insights in the biography that speak to how the writer created their most significant and iconic work, that kind of makes sense. But 4 volumes? I mean, how much of a life of another do we want to know about? So with the Kubrick question, to get back to that, the work, absolutely. In fact, I'm working with a publisher now who does this whole big series of books on artists and writers and bands, and they have, like The Who, mm-hmm. FAQ, and it's this 400-page book on The Who, and it's their entire career and so forth. And I'm talking to them about possibly doing a couple titles, and that sounds like something they might be willing to do. But in terms of biographical stuff, I'm really not all that interested. And frankly, it's because I'm not all that interesting. I mean, yeah, my books are, and the subjects I write about, and the films, and the Beatles, and King, and, all that stuff, we love it. We live with art and popular culture and music and books, and, it really enhances life. But me, I get up and go to teach, and then I come home and write. I mean, there's not a lot to say about it.
No, but you do it, though. You do it, Steve, for people's, enjoyment, and they like, people like reading about that stuff. What I find interesting about your books is that you get, and I think that's what people crave. You get that behind-the-scenes stuff, like with Grover Cleveland's Rubber Jaw.
Yeah.
All these things that people didn't know about. And I think that's kind of like, you're talking about writing about, talking about somebody potentially putting a book out about The Who. I think most people would maybe like to find out about the band's history, but they want to find out the nitty-gritty stuff. They want to find out all the behind-the-scenes stuff, the things that make those people, at the end of the day, they're still human beings. They still get up. They still brush their teeth. They still go to the bathroom. They still eat. But people love that nitty-gritty stuff.
You nailed it. That is the mission statement of this type of work. So I guess basically then it's a matter of degrees. 4 volumes on Henry James, I don't know, but a single volume on The Who, including the behind the scenes stuff, like I did with the Presidents, with the Grover Cleveland stuff, I guess that's probably more digestible to me. But to really dig into someone's life and focus solely on writing a biography, I've read some literary biographies of King, and they're interesting, but they're secondary to the work. So I guess it's just a question of scale.
Yeah. Well, people again, they surely like that stuff. A couple things I had in my notes I wanted to talk to you about. On your book on Titanic for Dummies, I know that the book addresses. I read it from cover to cover, and I read a lot of books, but it addresses a lot of things. Something that has kind of come up as of late, and I don't know if you could talk to it or not, Steve, is the band leader. I can't think of his name, but there's been some stuff that has now come up or come forward recently. Of course, I'm a Titanic junkie. About kind of in the movie and in a lot of writings, it's portrayed as he was there playing right till the end, and out in the open and what have you. Now there's some stuff that's coming up that's stating that maybe that's not really true. That they were kind of running for their lives too and weren't as prominent. Have you heard anything along those lines?
Wallace Hartley is the guy.
Right.
Well, you know something? There's always going to be speculation and second guessing, but based on what I read and the research I did and the primary sources I consulted, there's enough credibility in the accounts that I read to suggest to me that they did play as the catastrophe was happening. If we really want to get down to the nitty-gritty and say, well, how realistic is that claim? I'd say it's very realistic if they did it before the ship really, really went on an angle, in the early moments of the awareness of the catastrophe. So many people said they remembered the band performing on deck as people were getting into the lifeboat. I personally have no reason to doubt the account. Mm-hmm. Whether they stayed until they were waist deep in water and then tried to get into a lifeboat, which they didn't. They died in the sinking. I don't know. I mean, it's all interpretation, and I always try and get down to what are the empirical facts that we know. And the empirical facts are we have firsthand accounts of them performing on the deck as people were getting in the lifeboat. That, to me, is pretty credible.
I know that I think what spun all this up was that they did recover his violin.
Yeah,
and
right.
Now it's going to, I don't know if it's going to one of the big auction houses up for auction. Somebody with too much money is going to be able to buy it and have it hanging on their wall. But I did find it interesting that when that came up, there just a lot of different speculation came up. On your website, which I enjoy going through and I've spent hours on, there's an interview with someone called Douglas Faulkner Woolley about the ownership of the Titanic. What's that about? I meant to ask you last time you were here, and we talked, and I did.
Well, the interview, anyone interested, it's a really long piece, and you can go to the website and read it. And basically, Doug Woolley is a really, really, really unique character in the history of the Titanic because he claims that he owns the Titanic because of a discovery in a photograph that was made many, many years before Bob Ballard discovered it, and that he wrote to, I'm grasping at who he wrote to, some official agency in Britain, claiming under maritime law that, the first discovery, maritime law says, you find a wreck,
right,
you own it. And his contention is that there is evidence that he has that proves that he was the first to really exert or assert ownership. It's not gone anywhere, obviously, because when Ballard discovered it in '85, and then, by the way, the U.S. Navy owned the Titanic for about an hour.
Right.
I don't know if you were aware of that. Because when Bob Ballard discovered it, he was on a mission for the Navy.
Right. He was looking at a nuclear, one of the nuclear subs.
Two. He was looking for two nuclear subs that were lost, and were afraid that they had been taken by the Russians, but they had imploded from mechanical failure. So once he found those, they gave him permission to use the remaining period of the mission to go look for Titanic because he had an idea about where it was. And he found it, and the first words were wreckage. They saw a boiler of the Titanic.
Right.
Now, maritime law, right? You find it, you own it. And the Navy's, as soon as they released the coordinates, the world went crazy, and the Navy said, we don't want anything to do with it. Mm-hmm. We decline any ownership whatsoever. So that meant that someone had to go down and bring something up, and RMS Titanic Incorporated, which was formed by George Tulloch, a BMW dealer in Fairfield, Connecticut, he raised the funding to rent or lease one of the few subs that could go to that depth and brought back something from the debris field. And to this day, the legal owner of the Titanic and its debris field is RMS Titanic Incorporated. George passed away in '94, but the company still exists, and that's who I worked with when getting permission to shoot photographs in the Titanic artifact exhibition that we saw up here in Foxwoods, and so they're still the owners. But Doug has always claimed that, he has complied with the legal requirements to assert ownership of a lost wreck, and from last time I talked to him, they were still in the courts. They were still filing suits, and they were still, who knows if it'll get anywhere. But he's also trying this with the Queen Elizabeth.
Now, I've seen many programs. Ballard. I know one of the latest ones, I think, was done just a year or so ago. I know Ballard's kind of sad. He mentioned on several occasions he's sorry that he didn't take ownership because he could have stopped all the looting that took place.
Very anti-salvaging.
Yeah,
very.
He was very disappointed that he didn't do it. He could have just cordoned it off. It would have been his. He could have, agreed to who could go down and stuff. But because the ship has been really, it's been picked heavy. And I know his biggest fear, and he said it a couple of times, is that he always has the fear that one of these expeditions will drop some sort of charge in it and, blow it apart and go through and pick it clean. And that's the one thing he's made mention several times, that he hopes and begs that will never happen, because there's tons of stuff in there. They've only scratched the surface of what they found.
Well, first of all, that would be absolutely illegal. And anyone who even considered that, if anybody did that, we're talking major international crime.
Right.
Because the court has ruled that the only retrievable artifacts from Titanic are from the debris field.
Right.
They can go in the ship only for photographs. And it's a bit disingenuous that, he says that he'd cordon it off. That ship is being consumed by iron-eating bacteria. And in 50 to 100 years, the experts are saying it's going to be a stain on the ocean floor. Mm-hmm. Now, do we owe future generations all that we can do to chronicle this particular disaster? We salvaged Gettysburg. We didn't leave the guns and the bullets and the vests and the hats and the uniforms lying on the field. We salvaged it. They went in museums. They were clean. They were protected. They were presentable for future generations. With Titanic dying, and if you look at the silhouette of photos of Titanic over the last 30 years, you can see it shrinking in on itself.
Right.
And you are 100% right. There's a car inside Titanic. There are safes. There's probably billions of dollars in left-behind jewelry and gold, but nothing can be taken from inside the ship. Now, regarding accidents, yes, there has been some damage based on subs landing on the foredeck and so forth and so on, but the idea that somebody would dare to drop an explosive charge so that it would rip open the ship and then they would plunder it, that's so far-fetched and utterly illegal.
Right.
It just doesn't. I can't see it happening because no one would be able to profit. because that would be a known thing. I mean, it's not something, it would leak that someone had done that.
Yeah.
Because RMS Titanic must visit the wreck once a year in order to maintain that salvor in possession status. And Pat, you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Something clicked here, and I thought I lost you.
No, you're good. You did for a minute, but you're back.
Okay, salvor in possession. They have to go down once a year. Some years they go photographically, and some years they salvage. But they've brought up 8,800, 9,000 items so far. So I don't think that they're going to be doing much salvaging because they've brought up pretty much everything significant so far. Now it would just be duplicating, more dishes, more cutlery, more this, more that, So he's against salvaging. My personal position, and I actually make my students write a persuasive and argumentative essay on are you pro-salvaging or anti-salvaging. I give a whole lecture on it and talk about the morality and the logistics and the legalities and all that. And I am pro-salvaging because I believe we owe it to the future to make sure that we know everything there is to know.
I agree.
He's anti-salvaging because, I get it. 1,000 people fell to the bottom, and their bodies were never recovered. Now, does that make it a graveyard? And that's the primary anti-salvaging argument, that only 300 or 400 bodies were recovered from the water. So people did die on the site 2.5 miles down. But by 1940, all organic matter was gone, including the tens of thousands of pounds of meat and eggs and fish in the kitchens of the Titanic. All that was gone. Mm-hmm. So it's been 75 years or better since there has been anything remotely organic or human down there. So, but again, you're right. It's a very hot topic still.
Are there still Titanic expeditions? Are people still diving on the ship?
Once a year. They got to go. RMS Titanic must go once a year by law. As to others, it's an incredibly costly endeavor. Every now and then you hear about privately funded expeditions. A couple got married on the Titanic. A radio station paid to send them down there with a minister in the sub, and they landed on the foredeck and were married on Titanic.
Oh, wow.
Okay, that story's in Titanic for Dummies, and but that's Pat, that's few and far between. The money is just, and this is part of the reason why RMS Titanic has these traveling exhibitions, because they have to constantly fund these expeditions because they can't, sell the artifacts unless they sell them as a whole, which they did a couple years ago to bring in millions of dollars. But still, it's a very costly endeavor. It's 2.5 miles down. It's not like, the Pearl Harbor thing at the Arizona, which is right there.
Right.
This is a real endeavor to get down there. So.
Yeah. No, it's like you say, costly, very dangerous.
Oh, very dangerous.
I don't know if I would want to go do that. But what do you now? Who was the guy? With all your research, who was the guy that supposedly before Ballard, the Texas billionaire that found the propeller blade? Or was that just?
Yeah, it wasn't.
Okay.
It wasn't a propeller blade. It was a rock.
Gotcha.
He took a photograph and passed it off for years, or just claimed. And, I could see it kind of looked like a propeller blade buried in the bottom, but experts finally went at the photo and came up with the conclusion that it was just a rock shaped in that particular shape. So, no, he didn't. He was also interested in finding Noah's Ark. Mm-hmm. He was going on a mission to find Noah's Ark. And a couple of other really, really, unique historical artifacts that he was going to go after But yeah, that was his experience with Titanic.
Yeah, was his name Green or something? He was a billionaire or something. An
Yeah,
oil
yeah, he had a
tycoon.
ton of oil, right? Oil billionaire, yeah, from
Right.
Texas. That's right. Yeah.
Had a ton of money and was out there dragging whatever around. Well, interesting. Yeah, that ship is so interesting, and there's so many kids, young kids today. You talk to them about it, and I mean, I've actually run into some young people that they've never heard it. They're like, "What's that? What's that all about?" One thing that's been interesting that I've seen that's been popping up on the internet. There are some new photos that are coming up on the internet, and I don't believe they're photoshopped, of Titanic at port, and some new stuff that we've never seen before. Actually, I've found a handful of them. I do a lot of digging. And what I also found interesting is a lot of the pictures that we see of Titanic aren't really Titanic. They're Olympic. There's very few true pictures of Titanic when she was afloat.
The Grand Staircase, the picture that everybody knows, that's the Olympic. You're absolutely right. There were very few photos of the actual Titanic taken, and a couple of them leaving port. Those are legit. In fact, Cameron used them to model the exit from the port in the film. And yeah, they are coming across stuff, but you're right. The pickings are slim. There's very few. There was very little photography done on the ship, and most of it that went down with the ship.
Right.
So it's difficult, but what we can get a sense, because the Olympic and the Britannic, the three sister ships, they were 99.9% identical.
Right.
So we can look at the dining room or a reading room or a sitting room or the gym or the pool of Olympic and say, oh, well, that's exactly what it looked like on Titanic. Okay, now I know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, but like you said, very few real pictures. One of my listeners sent me a picture here a couple of weeks ago. I'll have to forward to you. Maybe you've seen it or not. It's Titanic pulling away, and it's one of them. It's real because you can actually see the name up on the bow, which is hard to see, but it's there. Very interesting picture. Very interesting. But yeah, an interesting ship. Let's change gears a little bit. From Titanic to the Kennedys, I know you've written about that and done a lot of research. What do you think about Ted Kennedy coming out the other night on television and kind of just heaving out everything in the world about his family and his father?
You mean Ted Jr. or Pat?
I believe I think it's Pat, the one that's the recovering alcoholic. He just
That was Pat. Well, he was on Bill Maher last night. And talked about last night or was it last week? I don't know, but he's got a new book out,
right?
And addressing addiction and depression.
You still there, Steve?
He's not in Congress anymore,
right?
And I think he's just trying to make his. Robert Jr. is the environmentalist, and he's trying to speak to emotional and addiction issues, and he's got this new book out. And his one of the other guests on Bill Maher made the point that Pat was making, which is that depression isn't character; it's chemical.
Right.
And Bill Maher is really kind of he's a bit. I like his thinking, but he's a little old school when it comes to stuff like depression. And he almost has a shake it off kind of attitude sometimes, and yet Pat was making some really good points in his book and in person about, hey, this is mental illness is completely neglected in this country because people see it as a character flaw, and it's almost always a chemical imbalance. And Maher had not a fight, but an ugly moment with the blogger Andrew Sullivan, who mentioned a couple times that his mother was on antidepressants and it changed her life. And Maher just didn't want to hear it, but Pat chimed in and said, yeah, of course, antidepressants work when they're used appropriately. So I think he's a Kennedy. That's a huge brand. I hate to be so commercial-minded, but Kennedy is a huge brand in America. And, if he's going to make his stand as an advocate for mental health programs and, anti-addiction programs, then good for him. Good for him. You got to do something.
Oh, I agree. I enjoyed the the interview. I thought it was interesting. Like you said, it is such a brand. I thought it was pretty interesting that he gave out a lot of the kind of the dark secrets about his dad and his mom, and he kept saying constantly, this is not too Kennedy-esque, as he kept putting it in the interview I saw, because we were taught not to talk about these things. But he's like, enough time has gone by, and people need to hear about it, that we're really humans. And I thought his comments about, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic, once a drug addict, always a drug addict, and got to keep it under control. I thought he had some good things to say. It was just he made some pretty bold statements, because again, the Kennedys have always, like you said, it's a brand. It's always, things have been secret. But he kind of went out and just said, hey, we're real people, we're human, and here's what we do, and here's what happened. And I thought it was a good thing.
It got a little uncomfortable on Mar when Bill brought up Chappaquiddick.
Mm-hmm.
That got ugly. And Pat kind of wanted to suggest, as respectfully as possible, that his father was depressed or had, psychological issues, and and one of who, I don't know if it was Mar or somebody, jumped on him and said, you're not going to tell us that that's why, the whole story, the Chappaquiddick story.
Right.
That's not why he left her, because he was depressed, and they changed the subject quickly. But, imagine having that baggage going through life with that brand, and yet something like that in your family happening and being asked about it all the time.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, I give them credit for keeping their chin up for most of the times that we see them,
Well, and again, didn't realize how much, I've never been a big Ted Kennedy fan, but the old man was, he was a roaring alcoholic, and kind of almost disowned the kids and the family a couple of times, and a very proud bird, if you will. Had to be a pretty tough life to grow up in.
Absolutely.
No matter how much
agree.
money you got,
you're right. Money isn't the answer when it comes to that kind of stuff.
It's when you've got that kind of, when you got alcoholism, drug use. I know he was talking about his mother, how she was, always out of it, but yet still found a way to keep it together. And again, people say, oh, well, the poor people, they were billionaires, too bad. Well, like I said, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, money doesn't really matter at all. As I've said many times, you could be the richest guy in the world, but if they find that spot on your lung and give you the 3-month diagnosis, it does, all the money in the world's not going to fix it.
Pat, Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
Steve Jobs, all the money in the world.
Right.
Dies in his 50s. Nothing they can do. George Harrison.
Yeah.
All the money in the world, cancer, kills him in his 50s. You're right. The money is not always the solution to everything.
Yeah. No, not at all. Not at all. Let's talk a little bit about, we've got a news break coming up in about 10 minutes or so, but let's talk about some of your new stuff.
Sure.
So interesting. A book about Breaking Bad. I got to hear this.
Yep. I'm working on a book about Breaking Bad. It's probably going to be a very intense quiz book.
Okay.
Broken down episode by episode. For the serious fan, 30 questions per episode, broken into people, places, and things for each episode. It's for the hardcore fan. My quiz books, I've done several pop culture quiz books over the years, and my Stephen King quiz book, one guy reviewing it said, it's like getting a PhD in Stephen King if you can pass these tests. But the point is, if you're a very serious fan, you may or may not have this information at your fingertips, but my mission, my mandate, my hope with these pop culture quiz books that are frankly very difficult is that they not sit down and try and answer the quizzes from their head, that they go back and reread or rewatch and find the answer. To me, that adds the element of fun. Because if you want to know what kind of car Walt drove or what was Jesse's license plate, and you can't remember it, you know it's in episode 1, so you get a chance. You have an excuse to go rewatch the episodes. And so I've always built that into my quiz books, where I don't like to do quizzes that are just, mainstream, everybody knows the answer type questions. So I'm working on that. I don't know when I'll be finished with it. It's a big book. I'm also doing I'm working on an Aaron Sorkin project. I'm not really sure what it's going to be yet, but it's probably, again, going to focus primarily on the work. I'm a really big Aaron Sorkin fan. Between the shows, Sports Night, West Wing, Studio 60, The Newsroom, currently on it. Well, it's over, but it was on HBO. And the films, A Few Good Men, American President, Charlie Wilson's War, The Social Network.
Oh, Charlie Wilson's War. I love that movie. I think
that's Aaron. Yeah, that's Aaron. And
what an
Moneyball.
amazing movie.
Yeah, and I'm a really, really big fan. So I'm doing that. And also I'm thinking, I don't know if you knew, I was in a documentary about Robin Williams this year.
And I wanted to talk about that maybe in the second hour.
Yeah, I was in it, and it was because I did a book on Robin Williams, but it's out of date. It only goes up as far as Hamlet, but they wanted me in it. It was an ITV British documentary that just aired here on the Reels, REELZ, cable station. It's called Autopsy, the final days of Robin Williams, and in it, the cause of death is revealed. And I'm thinking of possibly updating the book now. I don't know. I may or may not. I'll be honest. I find it, I don't know if other fans are feeling this way, but I find it difficult to watch his stuff now.
Yeah.
I can't watch it without that dark cloud of his end hanging over it. And anything I watch, I keep asking myself, well, how was he feeling during this? Was he depressed? You know what I mean? So I don't know if I have the heart to go back and rewatch all the new stuff since Hamlet and write chapters and reviews about each of them. I don't know. I'm thinking about it.
Just a little side note on Robin Williams. At the end of the month, we have a show that we put together called Game and Movie Empire. I've got a couple friends of mine. They're actually independent filmmakers here in Salt Lake. They're heavy into gaming and all this other stuff, and it gives me a little break, gives me one weekend off where I can spend time with family, and they come in and do the show. And one of the guys, Arthur Kemp, he had an opportunity to meet Robin Williams up at the Sundance Film Festival.
Sure.
And he said, what a genuine, down-to-earth guy who was bigger than life, but yet he would sit there and talk to anybody, had just an unbelievable type of personality. Again, bigger than life, a big Hollywood star, but yet he'd sit down and just talk to the common guy as long as he wanted to, and on filmmaking and on comedies. And he said it was just, he had about a 10-minute conversation with him, and he said it changed his life.
Wow. I'd never met him. Never met him when I did my book. We sent him one, never heard back, but that's not uncommon. But now I don't know. There's that. I got that. Maybe I'll get over it. Maybe I'll get past it and be able to embrace the body of work for what the brilliance it was, and be able to write about him again. But right now, there's just too much sadness. There's a tinge of sadness attached to it. My girlfriend updated her after Robin died. She's a huge fan. She now owns the entire Robin Williams catalog, and still she just bought the complete Mork and Mindy. She's a huge fan, and she still dives right in and loves watching them. But then I see some stuff, especially from the later work, and it just, to me, it's still heartbreaking to me. I really love the guy. I loved his work, and you're right, he was an everyman, and so it was. We'll see. We'll see.
What do you it was such a shock. Do you think that with all the looking into it that you've done, do you think he was battling depression? Do you think his comedy was the cover up for depression?
No, he had early Parkinson's, which he knew about, but hadn't really impacted him badly yet. But what he did have, and this was the cause of his death, he had undiagnosed Lewy body syndrome. They didn't learn about that until the autopsy. Lewy bodies are proteins in the brain. That's a combination of Parkinson's, ALS, MS, Alzheimer's. It's a horrible, horrible, horrible disease. And Lewy body, one of the awful things about it is that it causes visual hallucinations. And one of the visual hallucinations that many sufferers have reported is that they see little people, little creatures, running around their legs. And Robin was at a stage, based on what they discovered in the autopsy, Robin was at the stage where he was probably experiencing delusions and visual and audio hallucinations. And just, it boils down to this, Pat. He thought he was losing his mind and figured, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Because there was no explanation. He had no explanation. Now, if he had been diagnosed, who knows? There are treatments. There are medications. Many of them are similar to what they give to Parkinson's patients. But a lot of people, matter of fact, Kelsey Grammer had a whole TV series called Boss, 2 seasons, several years ago. He was the mayor of Chicago, and he had Lewy body syndrome in the show. And it was amazing. His portrayal was incredible. And we didn't know this until the autopsy, and it was revealed in this documentary. The doctor who studied the autopsy is the guy who actually said it on air. But we all knew about it because that was what was reported. And it's like a 2 plus 2 equals 4. You say, oh, of course, that makes total sense. He's experiencing these insane delusions and hallucinations. He was on mild doses of an antidepressant. He was not addicted. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't on drugs. His body was clean, except for caffeine and some mild antidepressants. So there's no way that he was, life is terrible, I'm going to end it all. No. He had something happening to him he couldn't understand, couldn't explain, and couldn't take.
And was a proud guy,
Yeah, right.